Hi, this is Mrs. Schultz, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background information about the Great Migration before you start the primary source activity. This is Newark on a map. We're going to explore the dramatic movement of African Americans from southern states to northern cities at the beginning of the 20th century. Although African Americans migrated to cities all across the country, we're going to focus on Newark, New Jersey, as a case study of the forces that pushed and pulled African Americans to migrate. In order to understand why this migration occurred, we first need to consider the historical context in which it took place. Disenfranchisement. In 1867, African American men voted for the first time in the South. More than 1,500 African Americans were elected to office from 1865 to 1876. However, beginning in the late 1860s, white Southern vigilante groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, used violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting. Poll taxes and grandfather clauses also effectively disenfranchised freedmen or freed slaves and future generations of African Americans. Sharecropping. After emancipation, previously enslaved African Americans sought employment, and Southern plantation owners sought cheap labor. Laws barred African Americans in the South from most occupations other than agricultural labor. Sharecropping became the dominant economic system in Southern agriculture. In this system, landowners signed agreements with farmers to work the land in exchange for a share of the harvested crop. Landowners or local merchants often sold or leased farming supplies such as seeds, fertilizer, and farming tools to sharecroppers on credit. The sharecroppers would then repay the landowners after the crops were harvested. However, high interest rates, unfair contracts, and unpredictable harvests often led sharecroppers to become deeply indebted to landowners. Laws often made it difficult for sharecroppers to sell their crops on the open market and prevented them from moving if they were in debt. Approximately two-thirds of sharecroppers were white and one-third were African American. Jim Crow laws. After Reconstruction, with federal oversight gone and African Americans barred from the polls, state and local governments in the American South enacted laws mandating racial segregation. These laws required African Americans to use separate facilities. In the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, the Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's segregation laws and established the separate but equal doctrine, which held that segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities were equal. In reality, facilities for African Americans were grossly underfunded and far from equal. And here's a good illustration of that. Lynching. Lynching is a term used to describe a public killing carried out by a mob. Following the end of the Civil War, lynching emerged as a tool to intimidate freedmen and their supporters in the South. Although it is difficult to track exactly how many individuals were lynched in the U.S. because there are no official records of these illegal acts, estimates of the number of African Americans lynched in the South range from 3 to 4,000. Lynching victims were often falsely accused of committing a crime. Sometimes they were accused of minor offenses, such as testifying against a white person or trying to vote. Lynching sometimes attracted hundreds of spectators, and photographs like this one were sometimes even sold as postcards. Distribution of African American population in 1900. This map, produced by the U.S. Census Bureau, depicts the distribution of African Americans in the U.S. at the time of the 1900 census. At that time, the vast majority of African Americans in the U.S. lived in southern states. So, on these types of maps, you know that you look for darker areas mean more of something. So, in this case, this is where most of the African Americans live, although you see some movement up the eastern coast here up into like Virginia and Maryland. The Great Migration. This began to change during World War I. During the war, approximately half of African Americans moved to urban areas in the North, and this trend grew during the following decades. You can see some of the statistics here. Newark's population. At the end of the 19th century, Newark began to grow rapidly as a variety of industries were established in the city. Between 1890 and 1920, the city's population grew 129%. You can see 1870 to 1920. Newark's African American population. As Newark's population grew, so did its African American population. However, you'll notice that the African American population grew particularly rapidly between 1910 and 1920. Today, we're going to analyze a series of historical documents in order to answer this question. Why did so many African Americans migrate to Newark at the beginning of the 20th century? So go ahead and open the primary source document and complete the activity and turn it in when you're done. Thank you.